Coming next on Landscapes Through Time, artist David Dunlop travels to Venice to discover the dazzling watercolors of Singer Sargent.
I'm David Dunlop, a landscape painter in Venice. I'm certainly not the first landscape painter. Here, high above the Riva Schiavone, the Bacino, the Empire of Venice stretching out here as it did hundreds and hundreds of years, and artists came here. They came right here. There's the Campanile, Santa Maria della Salute, San Giorgio. You have a view of it all. And artists in Venice painted the complete view of it all. If you were an artist visiting in the 19th century, like Singer Sargent, you'd want to follow in that tradition, but you'd do something different. Now, Sargent has seen scenes like this, lots of artists here in Venice, as well as English artists, like Turner, had come to paint this scene here. He arrives here first as a child, then as an adult, a young artist in 1880, and will continue to come here up until the First World War. He had just come from Paris. He'd been the toast of Paris. He had been taught by one of the very best, Carolus Duran, in the finest academy in Paris, l'École des Beaux-Arts. He was already prodigiously skilled. He'd seen the Impressionists. Sargent was a friend of Manet, a friend of Monet. He'd been exposed to the ideas of this new Japanese aesthetic of the high horizon. He's learned how to paint en plein air, outdoors. But Sargent starts with a palette more like Corot's, the new tonalist palette, the Barbizon palette. Soon he'll be adopting the palette of the Impressionists. How was Sargent going to make a difference as an artist in Venice? He had some new tools. One of those was the camera, because by 1880, photography was everywhere. The famous photographer, Carlo Naya, had already shown how to crop and compose differently here in Venice. It was no longer the grand vistas of Canaletto or Guardi. So Sargent was doing something very different, looking for little intimate vignettes, for some little slice of life, quiet places, the back streets of Venice. He would bring these new palettes, these new ideas, this new way of seeing. He could take this all in with the new idea of at a glimpse, the Impressionist idea. And he begins his adventure here. Later we'll go to the Campo San Giovanni and San Paolo, where Singer Sargent tries quick sketches in watercolor. I'm going to set up my easel where he set up his easel, looking with his imagination, using his tools.
Singer Sargent came into and left this world as a traveler. His first trip, an accident of birth, because his parents just lost their first child and escaped their sadness with travel to Europe. And so in 1856, Mary Sargent gave birth to John in Florence. Their life was nomadic, through the cultural capitals of Europe, sustained by Mary's small annuity. His homeschooled curriculum was languages, art, and music, led by his father, a doctor who no longer practiced. His best friends were his sketchbooks and his sisters, Violet and Emily. The tiny Sargent caravan found its way back to Rome as John turned 12. And Rome, as with so many great artists, offered John his first formal art education. He'd returned to Florence to study in the academy. The road, 6 years later, led John and his obliging family to Paris for his study at the l'École des Beaux-Arts and the studio of Carolus Duran. Duran would make a modern artist out of John. 5 years with the famous Duran, and John was ready for the stage of international art. Duran gave John the tools. Au premier coup, do it at once. Watch your values. Freedom and economy in your strokes. Generosity with your spirit and materials. Simplify. This was painting like Frans Hals and Velázquez. Portraits were John's road to fame and fortune. They were also his frustration and moment of infamy, which came early, age 27, in Paris, with his portrait of Madame X, or Madame Gautreau. He called the portrait Madame X after the French press excoriated him for the portrait's sexual provocation, its daring insouciance, its radical new look. Paris was no longer hospitable, but Sargent had options and lots of well-placed friends, from Oscar Wilde, Robert Louis Stevenson, Henry James, to Edward Manet and Claude Monet. Henry James put out the welcome mat in London, and London became home. Home at Tite Street. But home was also the road with his friends and sisters. America was on the itinerary by age 20 because, as an expat, he needed a passport. And there were family, friends, and business in Boston and New York. By 1890, with a mural commission in the Boston Public Library. Murals were big, prestigious projects in the 19th century. They made your reputation, as they had for artists for centuries. Sargent had already painted the massive El Jalal for Isabella Stewart Gardner, Boston's prestige client. By 1900, John was sick of portraits, and he said so. No more aristocrats with something wrong with the smile. He was through with the flattery and obliging the demands of others on his canvases. He turned to landscapes, to cities like Venice, and he turned to watercolors. Their spontaneous bursts of color, the unlabored release of personal passion, expressions of sunlight, moments of pleasure. He loved the travel. He loved the company. He loved the paintings. And that was his new problem. He didn't want to sell them. Without income from portraits, he needed to sell watercolors. His answer? Sell them in thematic blocks, 40 or 80 at a time, to museums. From the Brooklyn Museum to Boston to New York's Met, they eagerly obliged. Sargent found adventure in art on the road to Spain, to Capri, to the Alps, and to here in Venice. Here in the Carozonico, where Sargent found a studio, and he found other artists and subjects just as Whistler had done the year before. Or here in Venice, at his cousin's Palazzo Barbaro, where literary and influential friendships were born, where you could meet Edith Wharton and Robert Browning. Or here, on these canals, with his sketchbooks and his camera, Sargent found inspiration in sunlight and shadows. His camera gave him new ways of seeing, of cropping designs, of cropping Venice, her churches and gondolas, to frame the moving moment as the gondolas slide by.
John Singer Sargent changes over the 40 years that he continues to visit this city. His compositions, his choice of subjects change. From the contemporary life in intimate groups from the 1880s to shimmering reflections to sharply cropped architecture in freely described, saturated color.
For centuries, popes, kings, noblemen, artists, poets, writers, tourists, they all came here to the Campo San Giovanni and San Paolo, here on the Rio dei Mendicanti. This place particularly attracts artists from all over the world. Titian came here from a mountain village. Canaletto and Francesco Guardi painted in this courtyard. A century later, Richard Parks Bonington paints that equestrian statue. So it was the perfect place for Sargent to test himself. But John Singer Sargent is going to look with new eyes. He's doing his painting in a gondola. He's got a board on his lap like this. And he does some quick pencil sketches. He'll also do quick sketches in watercolor. Some more developed, some less. Do you see how part of this church is cut off? Just as the end of this bridge is cut off. That kind of cropping is a consequence of using the camera. He's found a new way to compose, a way that is contemporary with the new century. These are quick strokes. This is casual and relaxed painting. It's not something that's overlabored, and he wouldn't have used the rubber gloves that I'm going to use right now, because it doesn't matter whether you're using watercolor or oil. Those heavy metals are still there. Now, any pencil graphite underneath is going to be very casual and very minimal. So he's still using the tradition of linear perspective, as well as compositional forms that have been employed for hundreds of years. Poussin, Claude, Turner. For example, the frame of the object on the right and another one on the left. And slowly we have a vortex that moves into deepest space over there. So we have a line set up for a vanishing point on a sight line. That's my eye level right now. Not at the top of the bridge, lower part of the door. If I'm using a vanishing point, and I don't need to draw it in, this was all part of an automatic vocabulary that somebody very familiar, very conversant with the principles of linear perspective would do. Let's put in some color. We know, because of his study with complementary color, that he likes violets, blues, and especially popular among the Impressionists was the yellow and violet color complement. They're opposites, yellow and violet. Here is an opaque, light blue-green. Here is carmine, purple, a darker violet, white, ultramarine blue, two different manufacturers' ideas of a yellow, a gamboge yellow. And because he's going to scrub out, and these colors are transparent and non-staining, I can get back to the white. Now, if I want to warm that color a little bit, I would warm it with an iron oxide, something else he would have used to catch the feeling of rust on the boats, deep browns. And if I add a little bit of that to that color, I start to warm it up. And then I can still come back and remove it and get back to white. It's easy to block in from to light to dark if you've kept your design simple.
If you asked Sargent for advice as a young artist, this is what he'd give you. Begin with a solid and simple design. Sketch frequently. Observe scrupulously. Keep the necessary. Dispense with the rest. Simplify. If it's not working, scrap it. Start again.
And like Sargent, I could play with the wet paint on the wet surface, lifting some of the paint out, scrubbing it back down, as he would do to find stains and light. So I put on more paint than I needed because I knew I would be taking it off. And if I want something darker, I'll go in here to a violet because it's so complementary to the yellow. If I add a blue to that yellow, I would make a green. Simple, quick touches. And if he wants to deepen it, he can go to the carmine or his burnt sienna. And if he wants to neutralize that, he can neutralize it with the ultramarine blue. And with a lot of little marks, we'll suggest some buildings behind. Again, relying on that violet to give him some punch against a yellow. The darker this is, the brighter this is. Because a dark area against a light area, the light area is lighter against the dark right along that edge. We can mix together a couple of these colors to get a blue-violet. And to increase the shade on this wall or part of that roof. Testing first. As soon as that's dry, I can glaze it again and get these interesting color mixes, those that appeal to him. So going over it again helps deepen those colors. Now he likes the complements of the blues and the greens against the yellows. So, like Sargent, I'm going to put some of those other blues and violets into his shadows in here. As he applies the colors, whether he's making them deeper or lighter, he's thinking about the relationships of not just light and dark, but the color theory, especially the one he understands. Everyone owns the book who's an artist. Winslow Homer owns the book, Renoir owns the book. It's Michel Chevreul's book on the principles of color and harmony and contrast. And there is a wonderful description of simultaneous and successive contrast. That is, how a violet, when next to a yellow, changes the intensity of the yellow and the intensity of the violet, just as a light next to a dark changes the intensity of the light and the dark right where they abut. That simultaneous contrast effect is driving so much painting, including the painting of the Impressionists themselves. He's a close friend of Claude Monet. He helps him find dealers, he helps him make sales, they travel together to London, he stays with him at Giovanni. And when he hits it with the paint, he's not going to be particularly concerned that the color stays within the lines. Because interestingly enough, biologically, neurobiologically, color doesn't stay in lines. It floats in and out of them. Sargent and Turner and Whistler were a few of the artists to first experiment with that effect. In this case, his looseness, well, in perspective there is accuracy. In handling, it feels free. Want something deep and dark? Go to ultramarine blue. The dark will always contract and recede and push the territory deeper in. So that pushes that door in. It's just as easy to come back with the rag and lift any part of it out. Those violet shadows, observed by J.M.W. on his trips to Tangiers and Morocco. Delacroix notices in the bright, scorching sunlight that the yellow-white light there has shadows that are violet. And then, as Monet notices in the snow on a sunny day, up where he lives in the north of France, that the shadows on the snow are not gray, they are blue-violet because of the yellow-white sunlight. And all of a sudden, we start seeing this kind of violet and blue-green in shadows everywhere, from Sargent to Monet. And as shadows crawl across the campo here, they can take on their violet aspect.
A century ago, the Brooklyn Museum, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and the Metropolitan Museum bought large blocks of his watercolors. This occurs on the eve of America's first big modernist exhibition, the Armory Show of 1913. That's where Marcel Duchamp, Picasso, and Braque, and a group of abstract American painters were all introduced to America. Suddenly, John Singer Sargent seems a bit old-fashioned. But time brings us transcendence and a new perspective. Today, we marvel at his deft touches, his economy of expression, his freedom of gesture, the brilliance of contrast in his color, the sensual beauty. Just the simple elegance of his crop designs as they draw from those rich troves of art history that he was so familiar with.
Just as I showed you in the beginning, he could remove the paint if it was transparent and non-staining. He can at any stage come back in and decide to lift paint off. We'll let water do interesting things all by itself. Here's another example of glazing. Very wet, and you see it running off. But if this is dry, I can put a glaze on it that will change its effect, change its color. You can see what that yellow will do here. The colors, they're still there, they're just changing because of their relationship to the glaze. Makes an interesting mottled effect back in here. Let it dry before you put another glaze on. It's not much of a problem here in Venice because the heat in the summer will dry things pretty quickly. To hold on to this edge over here, I'll go a little deeper still. One of the wonderful things about John Singer Sargent, like Turner, was his courage with color, his willing to use what Van Gogh, in 10 years, in 1880 by 1889, is going to use a principle which we'll call expressive color. Sargent will continue to play with the experience through much of his life with watercolors, and that is to artificially inflate the value of the color, pump it up, just for theatrical effect, because that pushes this color this way. While I'm letting that dry before I put any kind of wash in the sky, I'll poke in some darker colors. More saturated color. He has the advantage of watercolor in tubes. There were many people selling pans of watercolor, but the records show he used tubes and flat brushes, occasional round brush, and his fingers. It gives the building just a little bit more solidity because of this dense, darker bit of color I'm adding right now. Sargent's whole family had been involved in painting. His sister Emily, who would champion his career, was a fine artist herself. Neither of them would ever marry. See how much more dense and solid the building feels with the higher contrast color placed in. I'm just going to now play with some washes, loose, carefree, and the light in his skies is often uncluttered with clouds. He's going to use this just for luminosity with a simple wash. This blue, made soft, diluted with white added. As you can see, it turns into a soft pastel. Gives me another kind of shape. I paint just sky shape and clouds show up. I'm not trying to paint a cloud. Now, I'll make it a little deeper to the top so that we can have more recession, because as you look at the horizon, there's more glow on the horizon. It's lighter, less blue, almost pink, and as we go up, we start to pick up more blue. And you exaggerate that experience. It's remarkable how your brain will continue to see a line when there is no line. I assume your brain's going to see this line is so strong, you'll continue it up, and you'll see this blue, and we'll continue it on to manufacture a corner, just like the Canisa triangle. I'm going to just soften a couple of these edges and play with the toweling so you can see what else it would do as he plays with rags to get some atmospheric effects up in here. The softer edges will give more volume to the clouds. You see how they're acquiring more volume. Similarly, if I put a color on my finger, remember, Sargent, Turner, Homer, all the watercolorists were also oil painters, and so they'll apply application techniques in oil to watercolor and watercolor to oil. So if I want a soft stain here with a soft yellow, or here, it's easy to do, just as easy as it is to take off. And if I want to soften the edge of the shadow, I similarly can just put water on my finger and drag it out and let it blur. Pull the color toward here. And if the painting were flat, I could let the color just float into it. Because it's vertical, I can't do that as easily. But even so, you can see how that violet is behaving. Sargent's touches were deft, quick, sure touches. Don't second guess yourself. It's really the zen of painting. You don't hold a brush in your hand. The brush is a part of you. But to do that, you had to practice. And as we say in today's terms, 10,000 hours makes an expert. Sargent had the advantage of someone like Mozart. He started very young. Okay, so let's just take that off, see where we are. That paint on the edges gives us an illusion that this is just paint. The window experience happens when we sharpen the edges. Art changes, tastes change. We have witnessed many of those changes in art since John Singer Sargent painted here in Venice. But something John Singer Sargent still delivers is the experience and the delight of looking, the sensual pleasure of responding to the light, the atmosphere, the sense of place, the cacophony of noise, and the sunlight on the water reflecting on the buildings. John Singer Sargent has shown us the color and beauty of the world in a singular way. I'm David Dunlop. I'm a landscape painter.
Funding for this program was made possible by the following. Coming next on Landscapes Through Time, artist David Dunlop explores the unique dramatic views of Whistler's Venice.